Raul Montero was much more than just a television host. He was a constant presence in the homes of millions, one of those familiar faces that felt like part of the family. With his gray hair carefully combed back, an easy smile, and a slight limp that, in some way, only added to his charisma, Raul had won the hearts of the public over decades on the air. His voice, hoarse but firm, conveyed a wisdom accumulated from years of interviewing iconic figures, from legendary artists to controversial politicians. But what no one knew was the burden Raul carried in silence. That slight limp, often mentioned almost affectionately by his fans, was actually the mark of chronic pain he endured without ever complaining. It was said that, behind the scenes, he was the first to arrive and the last to leave, driven by an unwavering dedication to his craft. But as the years passed, the weight of age and pain began to take its toll. Close friends noticed that in his last months, Raul seemed more tired. His eyes carried a melancholic glint, as if he knew the end was near. Then, on a cold and gray morning, the country woke up to the news no one expected. Raul Montero had been found dead in his home. The great communicator, the man who had been the voice and face of so many stories, had passed away quietly, alone. The cause of death was attributed to a sudden heart attack, but many believed he had simply given in to the accumulated exhaustion of the years. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The country went into mourning. Television networks interrupted their programming to broadcast specials in tribute to Raul. Videos of his most memorable interviews, his moments of humor, and the tears he could draw from even the hardest of hearts were replayed endlessly. His funeral, broadcast live to millions of viewers, was a ceremony befitting a statesman. Among the wreaths of flowers, one simple ribbon stood out with the words, "Here lies the last great communicator." But even amidst all the emotion, there was a mystery in the air. Raul's show, a talk show with phenomenal ratings, remained off the air for weeks. Discussions about who could replace him were heated, but the truth was that no one seemed up to the task. How could anyone fill the shoes of a legend? Meetings at the network grew increasingly tense. Executives, producers, and hosts argued incessantly, but Raul's chair remained empty, as if his presence still lingered over the studio. Over time, the absence of the show began to be felt acutely. The network's ratings plummeted, and advertisers started to apply pressure. Whoever took Raul Montero's place would not only have to fill the void he left, but also save the network from an imminent crisis. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and tension that the name of Lucas Ferreira emerged, a young host with a controversial reputation. Lucas was everything Raul was not: impulsive, provocative, fearless. His proposal was bold, almost disrespectful in the eyes of many. He would restore the show's ratings, even if it meant shocking the audience. And so, while tributes to Raul still echoed through the streets and the memory of his figure limping across the stage became a symbol of resilience, the shadow of Lucas began to cast over the stage that, until then, seemed to belong to Raul Montero forever. Lucas Ferreira's name was not unfamiliar to the public, but the contrast between him and Raul Montero was stark. Raul, with his classic and respectful demeanor, had built his career on the trust and empathy he conveyed to the audience. Lucas, on the other hand, was a polarizing figure. Young, charming, and fearless, he cultivated a provocative style that attracted both admirers and detractors. His previous show, a mix of investigative journalism and entertainment, was known for exposing dirty secrets and scandals, often crossing the line into sensationalism. When Lucas volunteered to replace Raul, there was a moment of hesitation. The network executives, still mourning, pondered whether someone so different was suitable to take the place of a legend. But harsh reality began to set in. Ratings were dropping, sponsors were growing impatient, and the pressure to bring the show back on air was becoming unbearable. It was then, with reluctance, that they gave Lucas the green light. He would get a chance, but with the warning that he needed to respect Raúl's legacy. Lucas knew that his opportunity was risky, but he also saw it as a golden chance to solidify his name in the television landscape. He meticulously studied previous episodes of the show, analyzing every detail of Raúl's style. Not that he intended to copy him, but rather to understand the formula that had captivated so many generations. The young host knew he couldn't simply take over Raúl's chair. He needed to reshape it in his own way. However, there was something in Lucas that no one knew. A secret fascination with the unknown. While many saw his behavior as merely a desire to shock and cause controversy, there was a genuine interest in him for what lay beyond comprehension. And Raúl's show, with its history of deep and touching interviews, seemed like the perfect place to explore this side. During the first recording under Lucas's command, the studio was tense. Producers and technicians, many of whom had worked with Raúl for decades, watched the new host's every move with a mix of distrust and curiosity. The audience, composed of both loyal fans of Raúl and new viewers drawn by Lucas's controversial fame, waited anxiously. The show began, and to everyone's surprise, Lucas conducted the episode with unexpected calm. He avoided the excesses that characterized him, maintaining a respectful tone as he introduced the guests. But there was something underlying in his demeanor, a sort of electricity in the air, as if he was holding back, preparing for something bigger. The first few episodes under his leadership were moderately successful, enough to stabilize the ratings and ease some of the tension at the network. But Lucas wanted more. He wanted to bring back the show's brilliance, but in his own way. He then began to introduce bolder elements, choosing guests that stirred the audience's emotions. Controversial artists, discredited politicians, ex-criminals seeking redemption, all found a place on the show. Lucas transformed the stage, once a symbol of serenity and reflection, into an arena of heated debates and shocking revelations. With each episode, the audience grew, but so did the discomfort among Raúl's longtime admirers. They couldn't deny Lucas's success, but they felt that something essential had been lost. The spirit of Raúl, once so present and welcoming, seemed to have been replaced by an unsettling shadow that loomed over the show. And amidst this, Lucas began planning his biggest bold move. A special edition in tribute to Raúl Montero, something he claimed would never be forgotten. Rumors started circulating in the network's corridors. Lucas was preparing something big, something he promised would be a tribute like no other. But what no one knew was that, behind the gleam of cameras and lights, he was becoming increasingly obsessed with capturing Raúl's essence and discovering if, somehow, that studio still held the presence of the former host. In the days leading up to the recording of the special edition, studio staff began reporting strange phenomena, whispers in empty hallways, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and that disturbing feeling of being watched. Lucas, however, seemed more determined than ever. He knew he was about to cross a line no one had dared before, and there was no turning back. Raúl Montero's chair, which had remained empty for weeks, was now about to be occupied again. But at what cost? The audience, hungry for something new and drawn by the promise of something unprecedented, had no idea what was coming. And Lucas, even with all his confidence, was beginning to realize that he was tampering with forces he didn't fully understand. The studio was filled with an atmosphere that blended anticipation and tension. The special edition in tribute to Raúl Montero had all the makings of the pinnacle of Lucas Ferreira's career, but it also carried a weight that he was beginning to feel on his shoulders. Ever since the tribute was announced, the audience had been ecstatic. It wasn't just the homage to Raúl that attracted people, but also Lucas's promise of an unprecedented surprise at the end of the show, something that, according to him, would defy all expectations. On the day of the recording, the studio lights seemed brighter, the air thicker. The crew, though professional, couldn't hide their nervousness. Some of the veterans who had worked with Raul were particularly apprehensive. There were murmurs backstage, speculations about what Lucas was planning. No one knew for sure what to expect, but everyone felt that this night would be different. The audience filled the studio, a mix of Raul's fans, curious viewers drawn by Lucas's controversial reputation, and of course, those hoping to witness something extraordinary. The front rows were packed with familiar faces, artists who had been interviewed by Raul, politicians who had faced his incisive questions, and even some of the late host's personal friends. The atmosphere was reverent, but also tinged with a nearly palpable tension. Lucas began the show with a respectful tone, a solemn tribute to the man who had paved the way for him. Images of Raul Montero flooded the screens, accompanied by a melancholic soundtrack. Clips of iconic interviews, shared laughs with celebrities, and emotional moments were woven together in a narrative that reminded everyone why Raul was so beloved. As the tributes continued, a strange sensation began to settle over the studio. It was as if Raul himself was there, watching everything. The audience sat in near total silence, broken only by emotional sighs and occasional approving applause. But among the technical crew, discomfort grew. Backstage, some reported feeling a presence, something they couldn't explain but certainly couldn't ignore. As the show progressed, Lucas gradually changed his tone. He began speaking about Raul's legacy, about how he had influenced so many lives, including his own. But there was something in the way Lucas spoke, a contained energy, as if he were building up to something greater. Finally, he announced that he was ready to reveal the big surprise he had promised. "Tonight," Lucas said, his eyes gleaming with an almost feverish excitement, "we're going to do something that has never been attempted on this stage before. Something that Raul Montero, if he were here, would wholeheartedly approve of. We're going to try to contact Raul himself, so that he can speak to all of us one last time." The declaration dropped like a bomb on the audience. A murmur of bewildered voices filled the studio as viewers tried to process what they had just heard. Contact Raul Montero? Live? Disbelief quickly gave way to a mix of fear and fascination. Many in the audience looked around, seeking some sort of confirmation that this was just another of Lucas's tricks to boost ratings. But the young host's eyes were fixed, determined, as if he truly believed that the impossible was within reach. Beside Lucas, a tall, slender man dressed entirely in black took his place. He introduced himself as Dr. Gabriel Neves, a paranormal specialist with decades of experience in seances. Gabriel was a mysterious figure, with dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see more than most. His silent presence only added to the tension. The seance began solemnly. The studio lights were dimmed, and a table covered with a black cloth was placed in the center of the stage. Gabriel requested absolute silence and explained that for the contact to be established, everyone needed to keep an open mind, free of skepticism. With every word he spoke, the audience seemed to shrink a little more into their seats as the sound of silence became almost deafening. Gabriel lit candles around the table and, with precise gestures, began reciting words in an ancient language unknown to everyone there. The air seemed to grow heavier, and some in the audience began to feel uncomfortable, as if an invisible presence was watching them. Lucas, sitting at the table with his hands firmly on the surface, kept his eyes closed, breathing rhythmically, trying to connect with the moment. Then the first manifestations began. The lights flickered, emitting a strange buzzing that echoed through the studio. The cameras caught movements in the shadows, but when they focused, nothing was there. A cold, inexplicable wind swept through the studio, causing many in the audience to shudder in their seats. And suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed on the stage, heavy, dragging footsteps, as if someone was approaching. But no one was there. The audience, now clearly frightened, began to whisper and shift uneasily. Panic grew as objects in the studio started moving on their own. A glass slid across the floor, a chair toppled over with a crash. It was as if an invisible force was taking control of the place. Even the technicians, who had initially remained skeptical, began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Then, as if struck by an invisible force, Lucas collapsed backward, unconscious, his arms falling limp beside his inert body. A collective gasp echoed through the audience, and some people began to rush toward the exits, terrified by what they were witnessing. The production team hurried to help Lucas, but before they could reach him, the studio lights went out completely, plunging everyone into absolute darkness. For a few seconds, there was only chaos. People screaming, running, trying to find an exit in the pitch black. It felt as if the studio itself had become a trap, as if the walls were closing in around everyone. When the lights finally returned, Lucas was standing in the center of the stage, as if nothing had happened. But there was something different about him, something that made everyone stop moving instantly. With an almost supernatural calm, Lucas looked at the audience, his expression now cold and distant. He thanked everyone for being there, his tone of voice unchanged, but his words seemed laden with an invisible weight. "Raul Montero," he said, staring directly into the cameras, "thanks all of you for being here tonight." The audience, still in a state of shock, barely had time to process the words before Lucas, limping slightly, stepped away from the desk and ended the show, inviting the final musical act to take the stage. But those who were paying close attention, those who knew Raul Montero well, noticed the detail that made their blood run cold. Lucas, who had always been agile and confident in his movements, was now limping, just as Raul used to. The doubt lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. Who, or what, really closed that special edition of the show? The days following that fateful special edition were filled with an unusual sense of unease. The entire country was abuzz with talk about what had happened live on screen that memorable night. Social media was in a frenzy, divided between those who believed they had witnessed a masterful trick, a carefully orchestrated spectacle by Lucas Ferreira, and those who were convinced that something much darker had taken place in the studio. Rumors spread quickly. Conspiracy theories emerged, claiming that Raul Montero had never truly left the show, that somehow he was still present, manipulating events from beyond the grave. Some swore that, in the final moments of the program, Lucas's eyes had taken on a different shine, something unnatural, as if he were possessed by another presence. And of course, Lucas's limp, identical to Raul's, fueled these speculations even further. At the network, the atmosphere was tense. Producers, technicians, and even executives, who had initially seen the paranormal seance as a bold publicity stunt, were now questioning whether they had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Many of the older employees, those who had worked alongside Raul for years, began reporting strange experiences since the program's recording. Shadows that seemed to move in the hallways, incomprehensible whispers, and in some cases, the feeling of being watched by something unseen. Some team members requested leave, claiming that the environment was heavy. Lucas, for his part, remained silent for the first few days, staying away from the cameras and the public. His only appearances were at internal meetings, where, according to witnesses, he seemed more introspective than ever. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a gravity that no one could ignore. Many noticed that he avoided any direct mention of Raul whenever possible, as if trying to distance himself from what had happened. However, the pressure for Lucas to clarify the events began to mount. The audience demanded answers. Sponsors wanted assurances that the show wasn't descending into cheap sensationalism, and the network, seeing the situation spiraling out of control, requested that Lucas give an exclusive interview to explain everything. The interview was scheduled for a Friday night to be broadcast live. The studio, carefully prepared, was enveloped in an aura of seriousness, with soft lighting and a set that evoked Raúl's era as an attempt to appease the spirit of the show. Lucas entered the stage wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, but what stood out most was the expression on his face. He looked tired, as if the past few weeks had drained all his energy. The interviewer, Eduardo Cardoso, one of the network's most respected journalists, began the conversation cautiously, trying to put Lucas at ease before addressing the more delicate questions. He started by discussing Lucas's career, his innovative style, and how he had managed, in such a short time, to revitalize the show. Lucas responded politely, but without his usual enthusiasm. His voice was lower, his gaze often drifting to the floor or to the shadows in the studio. Finally, Eduardo touched on the topic everyone was waiting for. He asked Lucas about the paranormal seance, about what he had felt at that moment, and especially about the strange coincidence of his limp after the episode. The question hung in the air like a specter, and for a moment, the silence became unbearable. Lucas then took a deep breath, lifted his head, and for the first time in days, looked directly at the cameras. That night, Lucas began, his voice laden with a seriousness that made everyone in the audience lean a little closer. I felt something I had never experienced before. It wasn't just the weight of responsibility or the fear of failure. It was as if the studio itself had come to life. Something I can't explain, but it was real. I felt Raúl Montero's presence there, with me, with all of us. The silence in the audience was absolute. Eduardo, visibly tense, then asked if Lucas believed that Raúl had truly manifested that night, if he believed that the spirit of the former host was somehow present. Lucas took his time to respond, but when he did, his words were clear and direct. I can't say what it was, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. Something happened that night, something that changed me. Since then, I'm not the same. Sometimes, I feel as if Raúl is still here, as if he's watching me, guiding me, or maybe taking my place. The last sentence caused everyone to hold their breath. Eduardo, trying to maintain his composure, asked Lucas about the limp, an undeniable physical sign that something had changed in him. Lucas smiled, but it was a sad, resigned smile. I don't know why this happened, but since that night, I've felt this pain in my leg, just like Raúl did. It's as if I'm carrying part of him with me, and honestly, I don't know how much longer I can do this. The revelation had an immediate impact. The audience was divided between astonishment and fear, while social media exploded with theories and heated debates. The interview ended with Lucas thanking everyone for their support and, enigmatically, suggesting that the show might take a different direction in the future, if Raúl permits. In the days that followed, the situation intensified. Reports of paranormal phenomena in the studio became more frequent, with some witnesses claiming to see Raúl's silhouette in the background of recordings, like a shadow that refused to leave. Lucas's health began to deteriorate, and he started avoiding public appearances, becoming increasingly reclusive. The question of who was really in control, Lucas or Raúl, became a national obsession. And as the show's audience continued to grow, driven by mystery and fear, one question loomed over everyone. How far would Lucas be willing to go to maintain success? And at what cost? The stage that once belonged to Raúl Montero was now a battleground between the present and the past, between life and death. And as the studio lights flickered on and off, everyone knew that something was about to happen, something that would forever change the history of the show and the people involved. The recording studio, which had become the epicenter of a storm of speculation and fears, was darker than ever. The walls, silent witnesses to the events unfolding there, seemed to absorb the growing anxiety of everyone who passed through its doors. But that night, the final recording of the show would be different. Lucas Ferreira, the young host who had captivated the audience and revived a once-defunct show, decided it was time to confront the demons that had been haunting him. The preparations for the recording were shrouded in mystery. Few members of the crew knew exactly what was about to happen. Lucas remained reclusive in the days leading up to the recording, refusing interviews and canceling meetings. Only one message was sent to the production team: prepare for the truth. No one was quite sure what he meant by that, but everyone felt that this would be a decisive night. On the day of the recording, the studio was unusually empty. At Lucas's insistence, only the essential technical crew was present. The cameras were positioned, but there would be no audience to watch. The tension was almost palpable. The atmosphere was heavy, as if something invisible was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Lucas entered the studio with a dragging step, the black suit contrasting with the paleness of his face. The pain in his leg, which he now carried like a scar left by contact with the supernatural, seemed worse than ever. He didn't smile, and his eyes were empty, as if all the sparkle that once characterized them had been drained. He positioned himself at the center of the stage, where the table was still covered with the black cloth from the previous seance. With a silent gesture, he requested that the lights be dimmed. The silence was total. The few crew members exchanged nervous glances, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary, and possibly something terrifying. Lucas began to speak, his voice echoing through the empty studio. "Good evening," he said, and the sound of his voice reverberated, sounding louder than usual, as if the studio amplified every word. "For the past year, I've been in charge of this show, and throughout that time, I felt Raul Montero's presence by my side, but not as an inspiration. No, he's been here, in fact, and tonight, we're going to confront that. I'm going to close this chapter, once and for all." He paused, looking around as if waiting for a response that only he could hear. "Tonight, Raul, if you're here, if you really never left, I invite you to show yourself. Show yourself to me, to us, and let's settle this, once and for all." The studio lights began to flicker, and a cold wind blew across the stage, making the black cloth on the table flutter as if it were alive. The atmosphere changed rapidly. The cameras captured every detail, but the images they transmitted seemed strange, distorted, as if the very air around Lucas was charged with electricity. Then, something happened. Lucas's figure began to subtly change. His body seemed to tremble, as if resisting an invisible force. His eyes, previously dull, now shone with a cold, intense light. And then he fell to his knees, letting out a muffled scream that echoed like a painful lament. The technical crew, terrified, hesitated to intervene, fearing that any movement might make the situation worse. Suddenly, a voice filled the studio. It wasn't Lucas's voice, nor was it the voice of any living being. It was deep, hoarse, drawn out, and to everyone present, unmistakable. It was Raul Montero's voice. "Did you think you could replace me?" The voice echoed with a spectral force, reverberating off the walls like a shockwave. "This show is mine. It always was. Lucas thought he could follow in my footsteps, but he doesn't know what it's like to bear the weight of this responsibility. Now he knows." Lucas, now standing but visibly possessed by something inhuman, looked directly into the cameras. His lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "You wanted entertainment? Wanted to see the impossible? Well, here I am. I am Raul Montero, and this is my show." The lights began to fail, flickering erratically, while the equipment in the studio emitted hums and static. The crew, paralyzed with fear, didn't know what to do. Then, in an instant, all the lights went out, plunging the studio into total darkness. There were screams of panic, the sound of hurried footsteps, things crashing to the floor. When the lights finally came back on, Lucas was at the center of the stage, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his pale face. But he was alone, apparently recovered, though deeply shaken. He looked around, confused, as if he had just woken from a nightmare. The pain in his leg seemed to have vanished, and he now walked without a limp. He then turned to the cameras and, with a trembling but resolute voice, declared, "This show is over. I'm sorry, but we can't continue. I can't continue." And with those words, Lucas walked off the stage, leaving the cameras and the technical crew unsure of how to react. In the days that followed, the recording of that final episode was scrutinized thoroughly. Video and audio experts were called in to examine the footage, but no one could explain what had happened. The network, unsure of what to do with the material, opted never to broadcast it, turning it into an urban legend within the television industry. Lucas Ferreira disappeared from the public eye. Some say he isolated himself somewhere distant, trying to recover from the trauma. Others believe he was never the same, that a part of Raul Montero had truly taken hold of him that night, and that the young host now lived with that burden, with no hope of relief. The show, a landmark in Brazilian television, was officially canceled, but those who worked on it, who witnessed the inexplicable events, never forgot. And from time to time, some claim that in the silent early hours, when all the studio lights are off, you can hear the sound of dragging footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Footsteps that, they say, belong to a man who never accepted death as the end.